The sky that morning was the color of tin, dull and cold and bruised. The air smelled of old hay and melted snow, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes everything ache twice as long. The auction yard was already filling, the dust wet and heavy beneath the boots of men who hadn't loved anything in years. Felix didn't plan to stay long. He was only there for fencing nails and possibly a second-hand saddle if the leather was sound. He hadn't meant to linger, hadn't meant to look. But there she was. Caged like a mule behind rusted bars, with a rope tied loose around her wrists, not to hold her. No, she wasn't running. She'd already stopped trying. 20 years old, they said. Apache blood. A warrior's daughter, perhaps once promised to a better life. But now she stood barefoot on the wagon bed, her chin high but her eyes far, as if they'd floated somewhere no one could touch. She's barren, the auctioneer said with a smirk, loud enough for the crowd to bite into it. Sold by her own family. Ain't no use for her. Laughter followed, low and sharp, like the snapping of twigs under a cruel boot. Start the bid at $5. Hell, I'll toss in the cage for free. Felix didn't move. Didn't blink. He didn't even realize he'd taken a step forward until the mud pulled at his heel. 5, he said. The crowd paused, then burst. The kind of laughter meant to shame a man into silence. But Felix didn't flinch. His face held the same calm it had since his wife died 6 weeks earlier. Same wide shoulders sloped forward, same stubble gathering around a mouth that hadn't smiled since the fever took her. Same ring still on his finger. No one outbid him. They didn't see value in a girl who couldn't bear sons. He walked up to the wagon as the chain was unlatched. The girl stepped down without help, her silence louder than any protest. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. There was something holy about not speaking. They rode out together beneath a sky that refused to clear. His horse pulled the cart with her belongings, though it seemed she had none. Not even shoes. Just a folded blanket and a bundle of hair she'd once worn long, now hacked short. Her ankles were red from cold, but she didn't shiver. She rode beside him, straight-backed, staring at nothing. Felix didn't ask what they'd done to her. He already knew. The house was quiet when they arrived. One-story, slanted porch, a barn leaning slightly east like it hadn't slept well in years. 2 newborns cried from inside. He didn't look toward the cradle. He just opened the door and said, "You can stay. There's a stove. Floor's clean. I'll sleep in the barn if you need stillness." She stepped in without speaking. He caught a glimmer of her eyes in the lantern light, brown, but not dull. Fierce, like something had once burned in her that the world had tried to drown. She walked to the farthest corner of the room, spread her blanket near the wall, and curled her back toward him. Felix lit the stove and warmed milk for the twins. They stirred but didn't scream. Maybe they recognized her scent, or maybe it was the silence that blanketed the room now. He didn't look at her again. He knew better than to stare at wounded creatures. You wait. Let them come close on their own. The first night passed like fog. She didn't sleep. Neither did he. The wind clawed at the shutters, and somewhere outside, the coyotes laughed like men who'd won. In town, the whispers started fast. A widower buying an Apache girl? And not even a pretty one, just bone and shadow. What did he want from her? What was she giving? Felix heard the words on his weekly visits, but he never fed them. He bought salt, flour, milk for the babies. Spoke less than ever. His shoulders stayed wide, his eyes stayed kind, and the ring never left his finger. Back at the homestead, she swept the porch without being asked. Took the babies from their cradle and rocked them with a strange hum that sounded older than English. She never smiled. But her hands were gentle, and the twins quieted beneath her fingers. She never once touched the kitchen table. Ate her meals on the floor. Always last, always in silence. When he tried to speak, she only tilted her head as if translating. She never answered. But she always listened. The weeks bled together. Felix watched her mend a split log with rawhide and care, the same way a surgeon might handle flesh. He watched her carry water in a tin pail steadier than most men. And once, just once, he saw her weep. It was at dawn. He'd come in early from checking traps and found her on the porch, knees to her chest, face buried in her arms. She wasn't sobbing. Just breathing heavy, like her chest couldn't hold all the world anymore. She didn't hear him. Or if she did, she didn't care. He stood there a long time, holding the edge of the doorframe like it might give him answers. Then the baby cried. And like that, she stood, wiped her face with her sleeve, and walked inside. He never asked what the tears were for. Maybe she missed someone. Maybe she never had anyone to miss. The barn creaked in the evenings, and sometimes they sat in the dirt by the corral, not beside each other, but close enough to share the same silence. She began to leave her blanket folded. Slept now on the cot by the hearth. Still never at the table. One night, he left a tin cup of warm milk there for her. In the morning, it was empty and rinsed. The snow came early that year. Felix watched her wrap the babies in the shawl she once used for herself. Her body was small, but her presence filled the room. The fire felt warmer when she was near. Sometimes, he caught her humming as she washed the baby's hair. Not lullabies, something older, something with drum beats beneath the melody. Then came the moment that settled it all. He found her out back with a broken fence rail, carving it with the edge of a rusted horseshoe. She didn't see him watching. She'd etched feathers into the wood, Apache feathers, symbols of mourning and of strength. At the top, she'd carved two small birds sitting on a branch, eyes closed, wings folded together. That night, he made stew. Set out 2 bowls. She came to the table and sat down without a word. He didn't smile. But his eyes softened. She looked at him, full on, for the first time. And he nodded once. That's how it began. Not with promises. Not with names. Just 2 souls beneath a roof, each unsure if they deserved the warmth, but finding it anyway. And outside, the wind carried no judgment, only the snow, falling soft as forgiveness. She rose before the sun, always before him, and he never once heard her footsteps. Only found the woodpile neatly restacked or the chicken coop mended or the porch swept clear of ash and snow. She moved through the house like a spirit who'd once lived here long ago, not quite haunting, not quite gone. And the babies, Lord, the babies. They followed her with their eyes, as if she'd grown from the earth just to calm them. Felix watched from the doorway each morning. Didn't speak. Didn't need to. He'd grown used to silence since his wife passed, used to rocking infants to sleep while grief gnawed at his bones. But with her in the room, silence changed. It was no longer hollow. It was warm, a kind of quiet that soothed without demanding. Cora, he learned her name by accident, when a letter arrived from the Indian agent, addressed in harsh block letters. Cora, age 20, surrendered by family due to barrenness. He didn't open the letter. Didn't need to. Names didn't change what he already knew. She belonged here. Not because he bought her. But because the house no longer felt like a house without her. Still, she never cried. Not when the twins screamed into the dark. Not when the stove ran out of kindling. Not when the town women crossed the street to avoid her. Her face was carved from calm, her back straight as a blade. She walked with the poise of someone who'd once been feared. Someone who still remembered what it meant to be held in awe, not pity. In the town of Dry Hollow, her presence stirred dust in every direction. The storekeep wouldn't take her coin. The preacher stopped tipping his hat when they passed. One woman whispered to her son loud enough to be heard, "That's the one who can't bear children. You mind your eyes, now." Cora didn't flinch. Didn't flinch when children pointed. Didn't flinch when a boy tossed mud near her skirt. Felix had seen men crumble for less. But she kept walking, hands around the twins' cradle, face like stone warmed in the sun. He admired her for that. Sometimes he wanted to ask where she learned such grace. But some things you don't ask. Some things are sacred and better left beneath the surface. The snow thickened. She mended their winter coats with scraps from an old quilt. He noticed how she stitched symbols along the cuffs, stars, feathers, waves. When he asked what they meant, she only said, "Stories." And that was enough. In the barn, she repaired a saddle strap that had frayed since summer. He found her there one night, crouched beside the horse, murmuring low in her native tongue. The animal, restless for weeks, stood still under her hand. As if he too understood she was not meant to be caged. The twins began to prefer her arms. Felix didn't take offense. He was a good father, but she carried them like she remembered carrying something before. Maybe not children. Maybe dreams. Maybe sisters. Maybe someone lost to fire or wartime. One of the babies caught fever in early December. The smaller twin, with the pale blue eyes of his mother. Cora held him for 2 days straight. Never let him go. Drenched cloth in cold water, bathed his chest in vinegar, whispered stories beneath her breath. She refused to sleep. Felix tried to take the child once, but she wouldn't give him up. Not with words, but with a glance that said, "Not yet. I will carry this." And somehow, the fever broke. Felix wept in the barn that night. Alone, hunched in the hay, where no one could see. When he came back in, she was still awake, still rocking, still dry-eyed. She looked at him like he was the one who needed saving now. She handed him the child and walked to the porch. He followed after a time, bringing 2 mugs of tea. She took hers without a word. Steam curled between them like breath in winter. "I didn't think he'd make it," Felix said, voice low, cracked. She didn't answer right away. Then, neither did I. He looked at her then, not at her body, not at the scars near her knuckles or the burn beneath her collarbone, but at her really looked. Saw the tiredness beneath her eyes. The weariness she never let fall. "You don't cry much," he said. She shook her head, almost a smile. "Crying's a luxury. Some don't get to keep it." He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "I'm sorry," he said. He didn't know for what exactly, maybe for the world. Maybe for the $5. Maybe for not having met her sooner. She took a long sip from the mug and set it down. "You're not the one who sold me." But the words didn't sting. They landed soft, like a bird's wing brushing a window. He wanted to tell her she deserved more. But more than what? More than a ranch with a man too quiet to comfort her? More than 2 babies that weren't her blood, but now needed her more than life? She didn't need more. She needed peace. And maybe, just maybe, this broken patch of earth was enough. Over the next few days, something shifted. She began to hum louder as she worked. Began to sit at the edge of the table during meals, though she never quite pulled her chair in. Felix caught her smiling at the twins one morning, just a flicker, gone too fast to hold. But he saw it. He saw it again when she bathed them in the tin tub beside the stove, letting their toes splash water across the floor. She didn't scold. Just laughed once, soft and breathless. Felix found himself listening for that sound. They were a family now. Not by blood. Not by law. But by something older. She planted herbs in the cold frame by the window. Sage, rosemary, thyme. Said it kept the spirits warm. He didn't argue. And then came the day the snow stopped falling. Felix saddled the horse for a trip to town. Supplies were low. Cora packed a list into his coat pocket and placed a small carved feather in his hand. "For luck," she said. He turned toward her, surprised. It was the first time she'd spoken first. When he came back, he brought 2 bolts of fabric. One the color of honey, the other blue like the sky before a storm. She didn't speak when he handed them to her, just reached out, touched the cloth, and held it to her cheek. He never asked her to sew anything. She made a dress from the honey-colored bolt anyway. Wore it the next Sunday. Not to church, no. They no longer went. But she wore it when she fed the twins, when she dusted the mantel, when she walked across the porch as if it were a palace. And Felix, watching from the doorway, felt something deep and old settle in his chest. Not desire. Not obligation. Just reverence. She was the woman who didn't cry. Who carried grief like a shawl she'd long since mended. Who turned a silent house into a home with nothing but her stillness. And still, he hadn't touched her hand. Still, she hadn't asked for anything. Still, he found himself building things he didn't need to fix. A cradle from cedar. A second rocking chair. And a gate for the garden she hadn't planted yet. Because hope, he realized, can take root even in frozen ground. And she, without tears, without words, was the one who taught him that. The first time the smaller twin called her mama, it came out slurred and half-sung, like a bird testing its voice for the first time. It startled the silence, made it tremble. Cora froze where she stood, ladle hovering above the stew pot, steam curling around her wrist like a spirit drawn close. She didn't turn. She didn't cry. But her breath caught mid-motion. Felix, seated at the table with the other twin in his lap, heard it too. His heart stilled. He waited for her to deny it, to correct the child softly, maybe with a shake of the head. But she only stirred the pot and whispered, "Soup's ready." That night, when she laid them down, she kissed their foreheads without hesitation. And though she said nothing to Felix, she tucked the little one's blanket tighter than usual, her fingers lingering. Something had shifted. She never claimed motherhood. Never asked to be anything more than what she already was, a steady pair of hands, a calm breath in a crying house. But now the children were choosing her, and Felix, he felt the ground tilt gently beneath that truth. A woman barren in the eyes of men had become the only mother his boys had known. He found himself watching her differently. Not as a stranger who had survived, no, but as someone building something in real time, one careful gesture at a time. Her hands planted more than seeds now. They planted permanence. In late January, she began carving again. By the firelight each evening, she whittled pine into shapes, birds, branches, small hands folded in prayer. She gave the first finished piece to the twins, two wolves nestled against a full moon. For protection, she said. Felix asked if she carved them from memory or invention. She paused, knife in hand. "I carve what I miss." When she left the room, he touched the small figurine as if it could speak to him too. The snow thawed slow. Mud soaked the trail to town. The roof leaked. The world creaked and bent and waited for something new. And in that lull between seasons, Cora began mending things that hadn't been broken. The cradle, still sturdy, now bore carvings of thunderbirds along its edges. The porch railing had feathers etched into every post. Even the fence by the east field now had swirling patterns like wind painted into wood. He asked her once, "Why all the work?" She said, "So the land remembers us." One morning, Felix opened the old chest his wife had once used, full of things untouched since the funeral. He pulled out a shawl, blue and woolen, still smelling faintly of lavender. He laid it on the table as she prepared cornbread. "This belonged to her," he said simply. Cora paused. "You don't have to give me anything." "I'm not giving it," he said. "I'm letting it be worn again." She touched the fabric like it might vanish beneath her fingers. "I'll take care of it," she said. And he believed her. They never spoke of love. Not in words. It wasn't a thing to declare. It was a thing they passed between them when she left a hot brick at the foot of his bed, when he repaired the sole of her boot without mention, when she plucked a chicken for dinner though she never ate meat herself. Love was in the small. One day, as spring threatened to arrive, Felix was tending the orchard fence when he heard the sound of a cart pulling up. He stepped into the yard, wiping his hands, only to find 4 men dismounting. One wore a preacher's collar. Another was the town grocer. They didn't look angry. They looked determined. "We've come to speak with you," said the preacher. Man to man. Felix nodded once. Said nothing. "You've got a woman here, one the town's been whispering about." Cora stood in the doorway behind him, arms crossed lightly. She didn't hide. She didn't come forward either. Just stood like a storm waiting to be understood. She's living under your roof, raising your kin. But it ain't right, the grocer began. Why? Felix asked, quiet but firm. She's not your wife. She's not your concern. The preacher cleared his throat. You're raising those boys in sin. Felix stepped forward, mud clinging to his boots. They sleep warm. They eat full. They know peace. That's more than most children get. And what of her? One of the younger men asked, eyes flicking toward Cora. She can't bear. Can't build a family. Felix's jaw worked once. Then, she already has. The silence that followed was long. No one dared meet Cora's eyes. They left without further protest. That night, Cora didn't ask what was said. She didn't have to. The air was thick with the scent of pride and smoke. Felix took the blue shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders as they stood on the porch. I was married once, he said, after a long pause. I know. She died in winter. Fever took her fast. I buried her under the oak hill. I've seen the grave. I thought that was the only life I'd get. Cora turned toward him, shawl tucked around her like armor. And now? He looked at her as if the words might break if spoken wrong. I think she was the first chapter, he said. But you're the story. She blinked slow. Then nodded. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something sacred passed between them, something unspoken and whole. Later, he carved her name above the hearth, Cora. Not beneath his wife's. Not beside. But on its own beam. The twins began saying it in their sleep. When she bathed them, they clung to her. When she sang, they stilled. When they stumbled, it was her arms they fell into. Felix watched this unfold like a man witnessing the impossible. Not miracles in the fire and thunder sense, but the kind that slips in slowly, quietly, until it fills the house and makes it home. And though the town still whispered, inside these walls, no one questioned her right to stay. The wind changed when spring arrived, not loud, not brash, but whispering through the dry grass like it had something to say. It curled through the cottonwood branches and danced beneath the hem of Cora's dress. It didn't howl, didn't demand. It reminded. It remembered. She walked with the twins beside the fence line now, pointing out buds of wildflowers and teaching them the names she'd known as a child, soft, rolling names from a language nearly swallowed by silence. They repeated her words, clumsy and sweet, mouths full of joy. No one had ever taught her how to be a mother, but her soul carried the instructions like a forgotten song returning in pieces. In town, her presence still stirred discomfort. Women lowered their voices. Men narrowed their eyes. Children stared, then looked away quickly. Some houses kept their curtains drawn when she passed. But the general store boy began tipping his hat. A teenage girl once smiled and handed her a sprig of lilac. The wind was shifting. Still, it wasn't easy. The preacher's words from winter had planted something ugly in the soil. Not with Felix, he stood solid, as if rooted into the land, but within her. Quiet questions bloomed in the cracks of her confidence. She'd wake at night, hearing echoes of old insults, hearing her own kin's voices saying, "You are broken. You are not enough." She said nothing aloud. But Felix saw the difference. She stopped humming when she cooked. The carvings ceased. Her hands still worked the same, washing, folding, gathering, but the life inside them dulled, like a flame burning low in a wind that wouldn't let it rest. One morning, she packed a small bundle. Bread, a carving knife, and a turquoise stone wrapped in cloth. Felix saw it before she could hide it. "Where are you going?" She didn't meet his gaze. "To the hills." "For how long?" "A day. Maybe two." He didn't argue. Just nodded once. "Leave the boys with me." She hesitated. "They'll cry. They'll sleep in my arms." And they did. She walked into the hills alone, the wind tugging gently at her braid. She walked until her feet bled and her thoughts grew quiet. She sat beneath a cedar tree and placed her hands on the earth. I was supposed to bring children into the world, she whispered, not expecting anyone to answer. Instead, I carry the ones left behind. She slept beside the roots that night, dreaming of birds that couldn't fly but still sang. In the morning, she lit a fire and carved her name into the bark. Not out of vanity, but so the land would remember her voice. When she returned, the house hadn't changed. The twins squealed, wrapping their arms around her legs. Felix didn't speak. He only handed her a cup of warm tea and held her gaze for longer than usual. Was it quiet? He asked. No, she said. But it was honest. He nodded, like he understood. And he did. Later that week, a woman from town arrived. She was older, cheeks sunken, hair twisted into a tight bun. Her name was Mrs. Ellery, and she hadn't spoken to Felix since his wife's funeral. Now she stood on his porch, arms crossed, chin lifted. I heard your Apache has been caring for the twins. Felix leaned in the doorway, boots muddy from morning chores. She's part of the family. She's barren. Felix's jaw tensed. She's better at loving them than most mothers I've seen. Mrs. Ellery didn't blink. People are talking. They think you've forgotten decency. He glanced over his shoulder, where Cora was sewing buttons back on a shirt. She was smiling at the twins, letting one sit in her lap. I haven't forgotten anything, he said. I just stopped caring what small people think. That evening, Cora stood beside him on the porch. The sky had turned the color of rust, and the wind whispered across the fields like it had secrets to tell. They'll never fully accept me, she said. Maybe not. Does that bother you? No, he said. But if it ever does, we'll pack the wagon and ride until the wind's quiet again. She smiled. Not wide. But full. Then, quietly, like laying down a truth, I love them. I know. I love you too. He didn't rush. Didn't leap. He reached for her hand and placed it gently over his chest. You've been loving us since the first night, he said. You just didn't say it. They didn't kiss. Not then. Just stood there, hand over heart, while the twins' laughter echoed through the open window behind them. Later that week, they married. No preacher. No paper. Just the two of them, beneath the old oak tree where Felix's first wife was buried. Cora knelt by the grave, placed a sprig of lilac, and whispered something the wind carried away. Felix said only one sentence, I give you what I have. And she replied, I keep it safe. They carved their initials into the oak. F+C. The twins danced in circles nearby, small hands full of dandelions. In town, no bells rang. No church pews filled. But in the house, the silence bloomed. The fire crackled a little louder. The stew tasted a little sweeter. She began humming again. Carving again. Planting again. She built a small garden, just beyond the kitchen window, rows of sage, corn, and sunflowers. She let the boys press seeds into the dirt. Let them carry water in pails they could barely lift. Every evening, she sat beside the soil and whispered names of things that had been taken from her sisters' elders' songs. She didn't reclaim them. She planted them. And in doing so, made the land remember. Her worth didn't come in noise. It came in wind, in touch, in staying. And finally, she knew that was enough. It began with smoke. Not from the stove or the pipe curling in Felix's hand. This smoke rose dark and sudden from the barn, thick enough to wake the twins before dawn, thick enough to stir a scream from the chickens and silence the wind itself. Felix was the first out the door, coat half-buttoned, boots unlaced. Flames already licked the barn roof. The dry timber hissed like it remembered every drought before this one. Cora was behind him in seconds, clutching both boys, their faces pressed to her collarbone. The wind blew hard from the east, feeding the fire like a beast unchained. He knew, before he saw the shadows, that this fire hadn't been born by accident. 3 men stood beyond the fence, silhouetted against the flames, rifles across their backs. One wore a preacher's collar. Another wore a smirk. Felix didn't go for his gun. He ran straight into the blaze. The old mare was still inside. And so were the tools. The feed. The cradle he'd carved for the boys if the house ever grew quiet again. He threw water at the door. Useless. Heat clawed his face. Smoke filled his lungs. But he pushed forward, staggered through the choking blackness, and dragged out the mare by her bridle, coughing blood by the time he fell to his knees. Cora saw the men coming closer. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She lowered the boys into the root cellar beneath the porch and whispered, "Stay. No matter what." Then she turned. She didn't have a weapon. Just a broken chair leg she'd found near the steps. But her grip was steady. Her jaw set like iron cooled too fast. When one man climbed the porch, she swung once splintered wood against cheekbone, loud and sudden. He dropped with a cry, blood rising through his beard. The second raised a rifle. She didn't blink. But the sheriff came before he could fire. A lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. He didn't shout. Just stepped forward through the smoke, eyes hard, voice low. "Drop it." The man hesitated. "I said drop it." The rifle hit the dirt. The flames still roared behind them. But the fight was over. Cora stood still, dress singed at the hem, ash in her hair, sweat dripping down her temples. Her arms trembled, but not from fear. From fury. From the unbearable weight of having to defend what was already hers. The sheriff took a long look at her. Then at Felix, still kneeling in the mud, coughing smoke and holding the reins of a half-burned mare. "These men say they came to set things right," the sheriff said. Felix didn't look up. Just muttered, "They came to burn what they didn't understand." The sheriff exhaled. "Ain't no law against family. Not here. Not anymore." Then he turned to the men, cuffed the one with blood on his cheek, and sent the others riding off with fire still behind their eyes. By the time the sun rose, the barn was nothing but smoldering bones. Neighbors arrived with buckets. Blankets. Bread. No one said much. They didn't need to. A woman from the next farm over brought nails and timber. Her husband offered to help rebuild. Even Mrs. Ellery, lips thin and voice tight, left a jar of honey on the steps and walked away without a word. Cora rebuilt faster than anyone expected. She moved with a kind of knowing, cutting wood, sealing seams, packing clay between new boards to keep the wind from stealing warmth again. The twins watched from the porch, clapping each time a beam stood straight. Felix moved slower, his lungs still raw, his hand burned and bandaged. But every time she lifted something heavier than she should, he was there. Not to take it. Just to lift beside her. They didn't speak of the fire much. But that night, as they sat beneath the stars, he reached for her hand and didn't let go. "I'm sorry I wasn't faster," he said. "You were there," she answered. He looked at her then, truly looked. Her eyes were rimmed with smoke, but still clear. Still fierce. "You could have run." "I've been running all my life," she said. "But not from you." A long silence stretched between them. Not heavy. Just full. The twins stirred inside, calling her name in their sleep. She rose, but he pulled her back gently. "I want to make it right." She tilted her head. "You did." "No," he said. "Not just for the barn. I want you to know, the day I saw you in that cage, I didn't understand who you were. I just knew I couldn't walk away. But now I see you." Cora didn't reply. She only leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. Their breaths mingled, warm against the cold night. Later that week, he surprised her with a small gift, a wooden sign he carved while recovering, delicate and simple. It read, "Home is the one who stays." She nailed it to the new barn door with her own hands. That spring, the land bloomed brighter than ever before. The garden stretched tall. The house smelled of bread and cedar. The twins learned how to walk. They called her Mama with clarity now, not confusion. Felix called her wife with reverence, not habit. And the wind, still whispering, always moving, carried no smoke anymore. Only laughter. Only feathers. Only peace. The fire had come from men. But the family stood.